Good evening. Our final presentation, or I should say our final talk, we have a movie that we'll see after Barton's presentation. Barton Myers is an assistant professor of history at Washington and Lee University, and we'll all be very envious of Barton. I mean, living in Lexington is a beautiful place, surrounded by Civil War, wherever you look. And Barton just purchased a house that is within blocks of the Stonewall Jackson Cemetery, and he can walk to Washington and Lee, and what an idyllic situation, perfect place to be a Civil War historian, almost as good as Gettysburg. So Barton specializes Civil War history and also irregular warfare. I'm not sure what irregular warfare is. Is that like sailors fighting on docks? Is that what that is? Barbering fights? So I'm sure he'll have a lot to tell us about irregular warfare because he is a specialist on guerrilla warfare. He published a book when he was still an MA candidate, I believe. It's certainly his MA thesis. It's called Executing Daniel Bright, Race, Loyalty, and Guerrilla Violence in a Coastal Carolina Community. LSU published that book. We have in the back is absolutely superb. And again, let me say that was his master's thesis. He finished his PhD at the University of Georgia. John Insko, your main advisor? Yes, John Insko is a superb fellow who is a specialist in Southern history and in Appalachia. That's how you pronounce it, folks. If you live in Appalachia, you say Appalachia. We can always tell when there's an outsider when you say Appalachia. It's Appalachia. He worked under John Insko. He also worked with Steve Berry, someone who we really need to get to CWI, who's just a wonderful scholar and speaker. And I should also add that before Barton came to Washington and Lee, he was at Texas Tech for a few years as well. So Barton is again part of this new rising generation that you are hearing today. He has his dissertation, which has now been accepted by Cambridge. Is that correct? Yes, by Cambridge University Press. The title, Rebels Against the Confederacy, and I believe it is coming out this fall. Is that correct? Coming out this fall. One last thing about Barton is once you get to see how this new generation has its feet in the public history world as well as the academic world. He spent a fair amount of time at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Park as well as a student. So he knows how to speak to public audiences, and he is going to speak to us today about controlling chaos, the guerrilla war in 1864. Welcome, Barton Myers.
I have to thank Pete and the CWI staff have been so wonderful over the last year. Very organized and efficient. Very fortunate to have Pete at the helm here. There's not a finer Civil War historian in the country to be leading this institute. I will give my customary parental advisory warning for this talk. No, this is not a Guns N' Roses album, but this talk is a little dark. And it also takes us down a different, toward a different view of the war, a different Confederate war than the one we typically talk about. That. At the beginning of January 1864, Confederate Brigadier General Thomas Lafayette Rosser, commander of the famed Laurel Brigade and himself an adept cavalry officer in the use of raiding warfare, isolated three of the greatest challenges irregular troops posed for the Confederate armies and Confederate government. As a former roommate of Union General George Armstrong Custer at West Point, Rosser was something of an expert on bad behavior in the cavalry arm. In a letter to General Lee, Rosser described the partisan service from the perspective of a regular Army officer. First, it keeps men out of the service whose bayonet and saber should be counted on the field of battle, when the life or death of our country is the issue. Second, they cause great dissatisfaction in the ranks from the fact that these irregular troops are allowed so much latitude, so many privileges. They sleep in houses, turn out in the cold only when it's announced by their chief that they are to turn out and go upon a plundering expedition. Third, it renders other troops dissatisfied, hence encourages desertion. Ultimately, General Robert E. Lee would agree with his subordinate Tom Rosser almost completely. Guerrilla service under any guise or definition was not the West Point way. It did not respect the chain of command, some Southerners' notions of honor and legitimate warfare, and much of its activity fell into the liminal gray area still being hotly debated and defined by the nation's legal minds in relation to the laws of war. Lee endorsed the repeal of the Confederacy's authorized guerrilla service, but in January 1864, he also endorsed the promotion of John Mosby to lieutenant colonel, an acknowledgement of the value of efficient and controllable officers of partisan service. In February 1864, the Confederate Congress repealed the Partisan Ranger Act, with only Mosby and John Hans McNeil's commands retained for official service. Yet, that hardly ended the story of the Confederacy's guerrillas, because the Pandora's box had been opened. 1864 was a year when the problem of guerrilla warfare challenged both the Union Army and the Confederate government. Both saw the problem of unrestrained Confederate guerrillas. The Confederate government also had a problem with its own dissident population, Unionists and anti-Confederate guerrillas that they viewed as a problem of criminality and law-breaking, not open warfare. It was a year of attempted solutions, a year of controlling the chaos that guerrilla warfare unleashed in the South. It was also a year that saw some of the most brutal moments of the many local guerrilla wars that spread like wildfire across the South as Confederate command and control crumbled in neighborhoods. Raids, ambushes, jailbreaks, executions, torture, and massacres. These are the detestable ingredients of the guerrilla wars of 1864. From St. Francois County, Missouri, to the coast of North Carolina's Albemarle region, from the hills and dales of northern Virginia to the bluegrass of Kentucky and the swamps of Louisiana and northern Florida, guerrilla wars raged in every state of the Confederacy by 1864. A brief tour of the men, the commands, and the conflicts that demonstrate that by 1864, the local wars were taking their toll. During the American Civil War, there were essentially four manifestations of irregular warfare. Self-constituted groups or bands, sometimes called bushwhackers, outliers, or for some, just criminals. Their loyalty could be Southern Unionist, Confederate, or they could be waging a personal war, a vendetta, or simply out for gain. There were also the Partisan Rangers, a second group, authorized guerrillas under the 1862 Partisan Ranger Act, passed by the Confederate Congress, that astonishingly inefficient and ineffective body. And there were the regular Confederate cavalry that appropriated the hit-and-run tactics of guerrilla war as raiders and counter-raiders on occasion. Individuals using assassination or sabotage might also be categorized as irregulars, a fourth group, but their war frequently was even more personally directed and outside the chain of command or cooperation with others. But what do these different types of irregular soldier look like in 1864? How did their wars impact and change our great Civil War? No one has ever mapped the guerrilla wars of the Confederacy at the county level. So we face a challenge in understanding the true extent of the problems faced by Union and Confederate commanders in fighting, controlling, commanding, dealing with the problem of guerrilla warfare. The origin stories of the guerrilla wars of 1864 varied widely. Some were rooted in resistance to Confederate military policies like conscription, very unpopular, while others were spawned by the Confederate authorized guerrilla service. Still more were motivated by revenge, greed, and vendettas at the local level. What is clear is that many early Confederate guerrillas were inspired by the accomplishments of regular cavalry officers and the successful raiding warfare of men like Kentucky General John Hunt Morgan. Known as the Thunderbolt of the Confederacy and simply the Great Raider, Morgan inspired many to guerrilla warfare and even became a catalyst for legislation. Along with Stonewall Jackson's cavalry commander Turner Ashby, the Black Knight of the Confederacy, who was killed in 1862, Morgan was the model for the Confederate Congress's Partisan Ranger Act. Morgan's raiders fit into a loose Confederate strategy of cavalry raids, that while high profile, had their greatest effects in creating fear and diverting Union troops to protect rail lines, bridges, and cities in the border north. His famed 1863 Ohio raid, which focused on the disruption of Union communications through the use of deception via the telegraph, coincided with Lee's raid into the north in July of that year. Lasted 46 days and involved some 2,400 hand-picked cavaliers. It ranged across 1,000 miles through Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio before his surrender in late July near Salineville, Ohio. And while his capture damaged his reputation, his equally daring escape from Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus that November and return to service thrilled Confederates. His actions and the actions of other raiders came to be expected by a Confederate public seeking good news in the border south. His raid would be the farthest raid north of any organized body of Confederate cavalry invading from the south. While it caused terror among many in Indiana and Ohio, captured some 6,000 Union prisoners, and forced Ohio Governor David Todd to fill 500 militia companies in response, the overall effects of the raid were fleeting. The capture and killed of Morgan's command included some of the most experienced Confederate cavaliers and were irreplaceable. Morgan's Ohio raid would be the high watermark for his version of raiding warfare along the border. For many Confederates in 1861 and 1862, even powerful congressmen within the Confederacy, the hit and run, small unit, raiding and ambushing that constituted guerrilla service seemed to be the perfect solution to Confederate manpower shortages, the issues of border defense, and overall territorial control. It could be, they thought, a new, innovative military solution that capitalized on the Southern desire for individual military service and deeds of noble daring. It also promised a hope for local defense and autonomy of military control in areas that regular Confederate armies could not or would not have time or the manpower to protect. Now let's be honest, the Confederate guerrilla policy is never all that well thought out. Even by the members of the Confederate Congress and the War Department that designed the Partisan Ranger Act. Even its famous successes and high-profile raids were rarely sanctioned. They were ad hoc affairs with little overall strategic consistency. But raiding and guerrilla service had a powerful allure. For the men who joined this other Confederate war, it promised home front service. It offered, many thought, the opportunity to garner martial accolades and honor in front of one's home community, not on some distant battlefield. The added benefit of being able to see and perhaps even live at home was attractive to the men that had not joined the boys of '61. Whether along the border or in remote geographic regions of the South where the armies didn't go, the initial endorsement by the Confederate government, despite objections from some West Point trained officers, was all that it took for many young men to enter the war on their own terms. In response to the Partisan Ranger Act, W.W. Morrison from New Harmony, Alabama, forwarded his own guerrilla plan to the Confederate Secretary of War. Morrison, a trained Presbyterian minister, sought to take special care of the gunboats along the Mississippi River by raising a group of men to quote-unquote kill the pilots. This lack of concern with restraint seems odd, coming from a member of society entrusted with public welfare. As evidence of his military experience, Morrison cited training at Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, whose faculty eventually spawned the Virginia Military Institute next door in 1839. He also cited his acquaintance with Governor John Letcher of Virginia for legitimacy. Although he was exempted from the draft by occupation, the would-be guerrilla minister exhibited a troubling understanding of wartime conduct and restraint. Men from all walks of life could become partisans, and many were quite willing to put aside peacetime beliefs to use deceptive tactics that might later endanger Southern civilians. Thousands more Confederates would be similarly inspired. While disciplined regular cavalry on raiding expeditions provided the example, something was going to be lost in translation for the others who took up the way of the guerrilla. If John Hunt Morgan was the model for the Confederacy's authorized guerrilla service, Partisan Rangers, Virginian John Singleton Mosby, the UVA-educated lawyer turned self-taught irregular warrior, was its most effective practitioner on behalf of the Confederate cause. By 1864, Mosby and his 43rd Battalion of Virginia Cavalry were the shining stars of the Virginia Guerrilla War on behalf of the Confederates. He was the best of the Partisan Ranger Act in practice, and a rare exception in the benefits of guerrilla warfare for the Confederate cause. For a renowned military leader, Mosby was not an impressive physical specimen. While his endurance in the saddle was the stuff of legend, he was only 130 pounds and stood just 5 feet tall. For Mosby's men, many others in the guerrilla wars of the Confederacy, a brace of Colt or Remington pistols became the most important and reliable weapon in their war. James J. Williamson, a member of the hard-fighting Company A of the 43rd Battalion, described the tactical advantage Mosby's men developed as they gathered near Union Army encampments. With us, the fighting was mostly at close quarters, and the revolver was then used with deadly effect. The saber was an obsolete weapon, and very few carried carbines. In the stillness of the night, the clanking of sabers and the rattle of the carbines striking against saddles could be heard for a great distance. We sometimes passed between Yankee camps, but a few hundred yards apart. Williamson described how Mosby's men would leave the hard roads where the noise of the horses' hoofs would attract attention, and marching through the grassy fields, take down bars or fences and pass quietly through. Stealth was one of the partisans' greatest qualities. According to Mosby himself, his men had no camps. They would scatter for safety and gather at my call like the children of the mist. Union soldiers verbally abused Partisan Rangers, calling them guerrillas, bushwhackers, freebooters. Even Confederate regular soldiers cast aspersions on the partisan service. Carpet knights, featherbed soldiers were the epithets meant to shame their compatriots' chosen form of service. But Confederate partisans offered several defenses. One, they claimed legal status under the government's authorized guerrilla policy. Even the Union Army tacitly acknowledged it in the 1863 Lieber Code, approving prisoner of war status for authorized partisan rangers. Two, they claimed that their seizure of horses and other property was done under the same legal authority, allowing for maritime prizes. And three, they claimed that since they had to supply themselves, not the government, they did not get rich. Yet Williamson admitted wagons and supplies were destroyed, and of course the men were allowed to appropriate anything they chose before destroying the captured stores. As far as the charge of independent operations, Mosby's men claimed that he worked under direct orders from Jeb Stuart, and then Lee after Stuart's death. Mosby's men were more responsive to the chain of command than probably any other group of partisan rangers or guerrillas in the entire war. But other criticism dogged the Rangers. Union soldiers claimed that the 43rd Battalion wore federal uniforms to deceive them. Confederates in Mosby's command countercharged that the Confederate government did not or could not at all times provide proper clothing, and our soldiers were compelled to wear these to protect themselves from the cold. Confederates also charged that the Jesse Scouts in Virginia, Union soldiers, dressed in Confederate uniforms to deceive Confederates. At daybreak, August 13th, 1864, Mosby assembled some 300 Rangers and led one of his most daring and successful assaults of the war. A large caravan of some 600 wagons headed to resupply General Phil Sheridan's near Winchester, Virginia, was low-hanging fruit, and Mosby's men sought to pick it. This was a rare operation for Mosby, who typically worked with small groups of men, no more than 50 to 75 soldiers, more manageable, easier to swiftly attack and slip away unscathed. Attacking the rear guard of the train, Mosby's men moved quickly, and by 6:30 a.m., the raid was over. The 43rd Battalion seized some 200 prisoners, 200 beef cattle, more than 500 horses, and 100 wagons. Union soldiers could not be assured of safety in the counties bordering Fauquier, Loudon, Fairfax, Prince William, known ever after as Mosby's Confederacy. Mosby's Berryville wagon train raid was a signature success of the Virginia Confederate guerrilla war. But for all of Mosby and Morgan's successes, The guerrilla wars of 1864 had led to social and military confusion on a grand scale and a fundamental lack of control for Confederates in most areas where guerrilla wars raged. In most things, guerrilla Mosby was the exception that proved the rule. Obscurity, death, infamy, criminality, not honor, glory, or fame were usually left in the wake of guerrilla conflict. Most of the American Civil War's guerrillas were not famous. They were unknowns, nameless, faceless, to history forgotten. Arkansas's guerrilla conflict was filled with them. One of those guerrillas was Joseph Bailey, who fortunately left behind a detailed memoir of his service in Northwest Arkansas that went unpublished until 2007. And though Bailey rose to captain in the Confederate 6th Arkansas Infantry, he demonstrated the fluid nature of guerrilla service in the Trans-Mississippi Theater as areas fell under Union occupation and control, and Confederate regular army resistance evaporated in favor of irregular means. Many men across the South who became guerrillas had been members of regular infantry units prior to their change in service. From the Union Army's perspective, the transition from graybacks to gray ghosts was not a welcome one. Bailey describes some of the tactics of Arkansan guerrillas deployed in the field to protect themselves in 1864. We seldom kept a guard, but all lay down to sleep with horses tied close. We soon found that our horses could detect the approach of an unusual object in the darkness and at a much greater distance and more quickly than we were able to do. A slight snort, uneasy movements, or a listening attitude always called for investigation. Knowing the country, however, and the people as we did, we usually had but little trouble in getting something to eat for ourselves and our horses. A reliable base of supply and intelligence among the civilian population was absolutely fundamental to successful guerrilla activity. Bailey also highlighted the importance of reliable horses and horsemanship in the guerrilla war. I was the owner of a dark bay horse, one I had captured from a Federal in the early part of the winter that I named Wild Bill. He was a medium-sized, fleet of foot, splendid saddle horse, and endowed with wonderful powers of endurance. To say that I became strongly attached to Wild Bill is but a mild expression of my feelings toward him, and I somehow felt that he had, in a limited degree at least, a fondness for me. But for his speed and endurance on several occasions, this story would not have been written. While regular soldiers were critical of the feather-bed guerrillas, Bailey acknowledged the very real danger of sleeping in farmhouses as Union soldiers hunted for Confederate irregulars. In the early part of January 1864, some of the boys had arranged for a dance one night at a neighboring house a few miles from my father's home. There were a dozen boys, about an equal number of girls in attendance. The snow was 10 or 12 inches deep and the night bitterly cold. After spending some time with them, I concluded to go home and spend the remainder of the night with the home folks. Tying my horse out some distance from the house, I went in and lay down on a pallet before the fire and was soon sound asleep. Suddenly, the tramp of feet going around the house in dry, powdery snow awoke me. Feeling that I had been caught like a rat in a trap by the Federals and believing that death was the penalty, cautiously pulling the door slightly ajar, I saw to my inexpressible relief cattle instead of Federal soldiers. I think that was the worst scare of my life that I had during 4 years of war, Bailey wrote. For some time after that, I preferred the shadows of deep woods to the shelter of a house, regardless of the weather. A house was liable to be surrounded, waylaid at any time, and many lives were lost in that way by parties venturing to sleep in their homes. Samuel Hildebrandt of St. Francois County, Missouri, served on the edges of the Missouri-Arkansas border war of William Clark Quantrill and William Bloody Bill Anderson. Unlike many of the men of Kentucky and Virginia serving under Morgan and Mosby, Samuel Hildebrandt was no blue blood with wealth or educational connection. Hildebrandt might have been describing many of the Arkansas and Missouri border warriors' backgrounds when he described his own upbringing. I never felt inclined to go to school, even when I had a chance. I was too fond of hunting and fishing or playing around the majestic bluffs that walled in one side or the other of the big river. In his early 20s, when the war broke out in 1861, he was motivated only in part by Southern sympathies. more so by vendetta after local unionists hanged his brother in his own front yard. Though Samuel Hildebrandt alleged that he was a commissioned major in the guerrilla forces, he rarely cooperated with Confederate forces of any size, preferring self-directed conflict of revenge against Unionists and other enemies of his family. For many, the guerrilla wars of 1864 were highly localized, with community and neighborhood loyalties driving much of the violence. Hildebrandt stalked his prey with a Spencer repeater he called Kill Devil. His haunt was the corner of southeastern Missouri and northwest Arkansas, which stretched from Scott County, Missouri to Greene County, Arkansas, an area the guerrillas called the Independent Bushwhacking Department of the Confederate States of America. That's great, isn't it? Even the worst of Confederate guerrillas, like Hildebrandt, became adept at defending their way of war. My enemies say that I'm a bushwhacker. Very well. What is a bushwhacker? He's a man who shoots his enemies. What is a regular army but a conglomerate mass of bushwhackers? But we frequently conceal ourselves in the woods and take every advantage. So do regular armies. But a bushwhacker will slip up and shoot a man in the night, certainly. And a regular army will slip up and shoot 1,000. Trying to uphold the myth of the noble guerrilla protector, the Rob Roys of the South, Hildebrandt made several countercharges against the Union Army and Unionists. A bushwhacker lives by plundering his enemies. So did Sherman in Georgia and a host of others, with this difference, that I never charged my government with a single ration while they did so at all times. Besides, I never made war upon women, children. Neither did I ever burn a house, while the great marching, house-burning, no-battle hero turned his attention to nothing else. He further rationalized his war of revenge. In fact, the Independent Bushwhacking Department is an essential aid in warfare, particularly in a war like ours proved to be. There are a class of cowardly sneaks, a gang of petty oppressors like the Big River Mob who can be reached in no other way. A large regular army might pass through where there were a dozen times without ever finding these people. Barbarities were committed by a certain band of Federals that warranted our interference. Now, the U.S. Army was both flummoxed and disgusted by the Confederate guerrilla warfare that they saw. And rarely could they do much to aid Southern Unionists who were fighting the Confederacy from within. Ulysses S. Grant had never minced words on what he believed the Union Army's response should be to Confederate guerrillas. Grant's ideas about guerrilla warfare remained relatively consistent throughout the war, from his time serving in Tennessee in 1862 to his service as General-in-Chief in 1864. Writing from Memphis in July of '62, Grant expressed the fury of many senior Union officers. He indicted not just the communities sponsoring guerrilla warfare, but also the Confederate government, which he viewed as wholly responsible for that sponsorship. Government collections shall be made of personal property from persons in the immediate neighborhood sympathizing with the rebellion, sufficient to remunerate the government all loss and expense of collection, Grant sternly ordered. Persons acting as guerrillas without organization and without uniform to distinguish them from private citizens are not entitled to the treatment of prisoners of war when caught, and will not receive such treatment. This is almost identical to the Lieber Code. This stirred even greater fury among guerrillas in the Memphis area. Confederate guerrilla George R. Merritt of Senatobia, Mississippi, responded to Grant. If you intend to make this a war of extermination, you will please inform us of it. We are ready and more than willing to raise the black flag. There are 2,000 partisans who have sworn to retaliate. If you do not retract your proclamation, you may expect to have scenes of the most bloody character. Henceforth, our motto shall be blood for blood and blood for property. We intend, by the help of God, to hang on the outskirts of your rabble like lightning around the edge of a cloud. Grant was undeterred. Neither were the guerrillas. 1864 saw some of the most brutal moments of the American Civil War, and Missouri was center stage for many of them. In the aftermath of the September 27, 1864 massacre of more than 24 unarmed Union soldiers at Centralia, Missouri, the guerrillas commanded by William Bloody Bill Anderson meant a U.S. Army counter-irregular force of over over 150 Union soldiers in battle near the site of the morning's executions. The soldiers of the 39th Missouri Militia under a Major Johnston were armed with infield rifle muskets, and when ordered to dismount in line of battle, they were able to fire one volley before being charged by Anderson's men, who were armed with revolvers. Anderson's guerrillas gave no quarter as they moved among Johnston's surrendering force. Johnston himself may have even been shot to death by famed post-Civil War outlaw Jesse James, though it's difficult to confirm it. It was the aftermath of these engagements, however, where perhaps the most disturbing incidents took place. According to Brigadier General Clinton B. Fisk in his official report of the incident, Anderson's men subjected Major Johnston and his soldiers to the most inhuman butchery and barbarities that blacken the pages of history. Major Johnston was murdered and scalped. 130 of his officers and men shared the same fate. Most of them were shot through the head, then scalped, bayonets thrust through them, ears and noses cut off, and privates torn off and thrust in the mouths of the dying. Union Lieutenant W.T. Clark, who visited the scene of the engagement shortly afterward, proclaimed, "This should be washed out with the blood of the friends of these demons." Clearly, many of these guerrillas sought revenge. In Anderson's case, it was probably for the death of his sister in a Kansas City jail that collapsed after Union soldiers took his family hostage to try to stop his activities. And this kind of corpse desecration, mutilation, body part collecting goes beyond simple revenge killing. Other reports on Anderson and his men attested to them using hair or other body parts as decoration for their saddles and bridles. Anderson also carried a silk sash where he tied a knot for every soldier he killed. This is another form of grotesque but gratifying remembrance to these guys. A civil war almost certainly allowed some psychopaths to flourish and even led others into the path of murder, mutilation, war crimes. But consider the sheer, sick entertainment value of what these young men were doing. Killing and mutilating the enemy was not only exciting, as battle is for many young soldiers, but the murder of unarmed men and playing with their body parts was also amusing for these guys. At other moments, Anderson and his men decapitated federal soldiers and rearranged their heads, another form of entertainment through corpse desecration. Castration, rearrangement of enemy identities was emasculating to Union soldiers, a form of primal predatory dominance. If Bill Anderson and his boys had carried iPhones, Canon power shot cameras, Americans might remember the American Civil War in a somewhat different way. But the problems of guerrilla war reached beyond the naughty behavior of a few rogues in Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, to the very fundamental issues of command and control at the county and neighborhood level across much of the South. At the same time Confederates deployed guerrilla warfare in a war of national survival, enemies of the Confederacy were waging local guerrilla wars of survival as they sought its downfall. The guerrilla wars were messy local affairs that few wanted to remember in the years after the conflict. Lost cause mythologizers seeking to minimize the history of dissent and unionism on the home front frequently sanitized and or buried local guerrilla histories after the war. But the internal problems at the county level created widespread instability in many southern states by 1864. The question of overall impact, the overall impact of the guerrilla wars on the Confederate war effort is directly related to the county-by-county implosion of Confederate governments and civil war. What was the Confederacy in 1864? Was it the geographic space controlled by Confederate armies? In 1861? Certainly not. How much destabilization went on? Wow. This is a project that remains incomplete for our field. Some areas, however, suggest answers. North Carolina provides one example. From an important manpower and agricultural center of the Confederacy, in the Tar Heel state, a careful analysis of the neighborhood level demonstrates that 1/3 of the counties, 30 plus counties, were embroiled in one form or another of guerrilla war by early 1864. The greatest disruption and violence erupted in the old Whig congressional strongholds of the state. You can actually take a U.S. congressional map, and the Confederate congressional lines are the same, you can overlay it on the state. And what you see is that it's almost a direct correlation in terms of problems that the Confederate government experienced there. Without tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers committed to a counter-irregular effort against Southern militant dissidents, just in North Carolina alone, reestablishing firm control, stable occupation would have been impossible. The Confederacy did not have the available manpower to do this by 1864. In Yadkin County, in the northwestern Piedmont, North Carolina, Unionists and deserters from the Confederate Army became so strong that they broke into the local jail in Yadkinville and freed the prisoners, many of whom were suspected of disloyalty by Confederates. Confederate Major J.R. McLean decried the insecurity in Yadkin and the problem of Unionists and deserters in a letter to the Chief Justice of the state, Richmond M. Pearson, in August of 1864. In identifying these individuals, McLean revealed a group of men making up the entire spectrum of anti-Confederate resistance. A crowd of these jailbreakers, escaped murderers, deserters from the Army, recusant conscripts, some of them known to have been lying out for 2 or 3 years, and desperately bad men, escaped Yankee prisoners, and a few disloyal persons over and under the military age conscription, under the lead of one Alex Johnson, charged with housebreaking and stealing in company with Negro slaves in Davie County. About 150 in number left Yadkin County with the avowed purpose of going within the enemy's lines and enlisting after the jailbreak. While some of these dissidents were killed during their irregular activities, those captured by Confederates were treated as criminals and held indefinitely under trial for murder or treason. Some never make it to trial. Confederates did not grant irregulars status as prisoners of war and did not view them as legitimate combatants. One Confederate called the 1864 guerrilla war in North Carolina a state of insurrection against the laws. This was a serious understatement. There were no quick solutions for Confederates seeking to defeat dissident Southerners taking up arms against their cause. County-level chaos planted many of the seeds for the ultimate defeat of the Confederacy on irregular fields of battle. By the end of 1864, there were few real rewards for those who fought in the guerrilla wars. Plunder was quickly spent, lost, or recaptured, and a gruesome end awaited many of the participants in the years to come. On a personal level, the most successful and notorious guerrillas paid a heavy price. After 3 years of war, Union soldiers had experienced enough of Confederate sniping and pickets, stealing their officers, raiding behind Union lines, and waylaying unsuspecting parties of troops. Even Mosby's relatively disciplined command experienced heavy losses. In late September 1864, in response to what Union soldiers believed was the murder of a lieutenant by one of Mosby's Rangers after he surrendered, Union cavalry generals Wesley Merritt and General George Armstrong Custer executed 6 of Mosby's men near Front Royal, Virginia. Another of Mosby's men was executed in a separate incident. A sign on one of the partisans was left behind saying simply, "Such is the fate of all of Mosby's men." In response, the Gray Ghost had 23 captured Union soldiers draw 7 lots. 3 were eventually hanged in retaliation. 2 were shot. 2 escaped. Even the relatively tidy Partisan Ranger War of John Mosby in Virginia was beginning to unravel into retaliatory killing. Mosby struggled to rationalize and control the chaos that guerrilla war brought. It was not an act of revenge, Mosby wrote, but a judicial sentence to save not only the lives of my own men, but the lives of the enemy. It had that effect. I regret that fate thrust such a duty upon me. I do not regret that I faced and performed it. While Mosby himself survived the war and went on to become a Republican, a friend of Grant, and eventually U.S. consul to Hong Kong, many of his men were not so fortunate. A quick walk around Warrenton, Virginia's cemetery shows the costs. The attrition rate in the famed Company A of his command was telling. Only one officer, commissioned or non-commissioned, a sergeant, was available for service in April 1865. The rest were all killed, wounded, or captured. John Hunt Morgan's new command following his escape was unfocused and undisciplined, and Union occupation forces in Kentucky made raiding and mobile warfare more difficult throughout 1864. By June, His last Kentucky raid led him into the Battle of Cynthiana and the destruction of much of his force as an effective fighting unit. In August, he was placed in command of the Trans-Allegheny Department, where his relationship with Braxton Bragg and the Confederate High Command continued to deteriorate. He began planning for a new raid on Knoxville, Tennessee, the Unionist stronghold, that month. Union cavalry hunted Morgan down. Morgan, who had a bit of a reputation with the ladies, was in the process of visiting family friends when the Yankees caught up with him. The thunderbolt of the Confederacy was forced to flee out a window, down a tree, out the public road. He was shot to death along the road in Greenville, Tennessee on September 4th, 1864, still in his nightshirt. His body was later dragged through the street to cheering soldiers. Arkansas, Missouri guerrilla Samuel Hildebrandt's 7-year killing spree stretched beyond the Civil War and into the 1870s until he was shot in the head by a law enforcement officer after an afternoon of hard barroom drinking. Not surprisingly, William Bloody Bill Anderson's short life ended in a hail of bullets as well. In October 1864, a hand-picked group of Union soldiers was charged with finding him. Anderson was shot, charging the Union force with just one other soldier by his side. His body was later paraded through the streets of Richmond, Missouri, put on display for an anxious Unionist public to view. He was 24 years old. So out of the chaos and brutality of the guerrilla wars of 1864, what was the impact on the wider Civil War? One, we now know that the guerrilla wars were widespread. It affected more people than many Civil War scholars have previously acknowledged. Hundreds of nominally Confederate counties and neighborhoods were affected by one form of irregular war or another by 1864. Two, guerrilla wars seriously eroded Confederate command and control by early 1864 in Confederate states in both the eastern and western theaters. It was not just a border problem, but penetrated every state of the Confederacy. Three, the height of Confederate irregular success did draw off tens of thousands of Union soldiers to protect communications, intelligence, supplies, and transportation. But other Confederate guerrillas and dissident elements of the Southern population more than neutralized these great successes. Weighed in the scales, guerrillas were more problem than solution for the Confederacy. Fourth, we also know that many of the war's darkest moments come out of the guerrilla wars. Atrocity frequently lay at the end of the guerrillas' warpath. And finally, the Confederate guerrilla struggle ultimately failed in its bid to protect at the local level across the South. It weakened the Confederacy's military effort to prolong the war by draining resources, manpower, creating chaotic disruption at the local level, and ultimately harming the very people it set out to protect, the white Southern population. Guerrilla wars were messy and rub against the grain of the symmetrical battlefield lines of blue and gray that we've all spent years studying. Guerrilla wars offer unsatisfying narratives, but they also are important because they're difficult to make sense of. The costs of guerrilla warfare far outweighed the benefits that some Confederates saw in 1861 and 1862. Guerrilla warfare did play a role in determining the length of the war. It fundamentally weakened the Confederate state level and county level government's abilities to function. It helped shorten the war by ultimately weakening the Confederacy's ability to field soldiers, supply troops, control its own resources in many areas. The Confederate government hardly glimpsed the true extent of the militant dissident problem they faced before their war ended in early 1865. Raids, jailbreaks, murders, ambushes, massacres, executions, these are the ingredients of the guerrilla war in 1864, and these are some of the seeds that planted Confederate military defeat beyond the traditional battlefield. Ultimately, it doesn't really work anymore for Civil War historians to just talk about one guerrilla war. It's too neat, too tidy, too easy to compartmentalize and forget. We need to fully engage with the messiness of military history beyond the linear lines and contained spaces of the traditional conventional battlefield. We need a broader definition of military history, one that recognizes the local nuances of military problems across the Confederacy, the local wars of Samuel Hildebrandt and thousands of faceless others. But new answers about the rapid 4-year defeat of the Confederate armies and Confederate nation may be out there. This is not the gratifying war that we like to reminisce about. No, it's not. But it's one of the most important dimensions of the Civil War that we have not fully explored. And by the end of 1864, the guerrilla wars raged uncontrollably in every state of the Confederacy. Thank you very much.
Robert Dominguez, Chula Vista, California. This reminds me of elite warriors, the Navy, the Army, the Marines, etc. Are these guys maybe forerunners of like Navy SEALs or Army Rangers? That type of unconventional warfare. I mean, these guys are necessary, and guerrilla warfare is, I believe, is necessary. It just needs to be subject to the hierarchy of the military authorities. That's what I think. If they're running wild like criminals, then that's not going to work. But I think it's important to have this kind of thing. But what do you think? Is it like a forerunner of the elite?
This is a really fascinating question that you're asking. This is a good question. I actually have a dissertation student writing a dissertation on this very question, on the history of the U.S. Army Rangers, where the idea of the Army Rangers comes from, ultimately. And I think the fundamental thesis of that project, James Sandy is the name of the young man writing the thesis, he's come down to is that what we see is that special forces units, in the case of the Partisan Rangers, I don't think I would classify everybody at that level. John Mosby is certainly the beau ideal, right? He's the example, he's the most effective. But if you look even at a guy like Mosby as an example, as a forerunner, what you see is that they're engaging a unique problem with an attempt at an innovative solution that ultimately backfires as a self-inflicted wound whenever they really promote it to people who don't know anything about waging warfare, even in a regular large army without training. And what you see is that if you look at the evolution of warfare in American history, not to get too grandiose, but these problems reemerge, and the Army usually develops a solution on the fly up into World War II, and then you see the institutionalization of Army Ranger units, and then you see it grow in that way. But there's almost an amnesia associated with some of the problems that these guys end up focusing in on and dealing with through World War I, all the way up through World War II. So yeah, I do think that you're seeing a forerunner in a way, but there's no direct connection. The Army has a lot of amnesia. If you look at the post-Civil War armies, it takes a long time for the Army to reform. And that's a whole other topic, but it's a great question.
Yes, you talked about doing a more thorough examination of the guerrilla activity in the country in the Confederacy as a whole during the war. What are the problems in gathering sources about it? So many of these seem to be illiterate people. Where do you look for sources, and what kind of success have you had in finding?
This is an excellent question. You really have to use what you've got on the ground, what you can find. And you have to be innovative about what you're looking at. One of the best sources that you can look at, if they're extant for a state, are Confederate conscription records. Because it's often local conscript officers who are hunting down recusant conscripts who are the ones who are enforcing military policy at the local level. They're the ones that come into contact with Southern Unionists, with deserters. They're the ones that are tracking down, in many ways, escaped Union prisoners. Home Guard records, whenever they exist for a state, are another excellent place to look. Local newspapers are underutilized in this way. If you want to understand how Unionists were persecuted early on in the war, a lot of times you'll actually find it right in the local newspaper. There were committees of vigilance set up to assess people's loyalty. A lot of times they went door to door and asked people to sign an oath, and if they didn't like what they said, they took them in front of the committee of vigilance. So there are a variety of different sources, but you have to kind of triangulate them. You have to bring them all together. One source alone is not really going to give you the whole answer. And I was asked a question about how we measure this last night over dinner, which I thought was a great one, and relates. There are a lot of different ways you can do it, and I think our field needs to talk about that, but there are different metrics. Do the Confederates control the county seat in a particular county? Do they control the jails? These things are some things that we can't find in the record, in county records. How many people actually served in the guerrilla war is another question. Albert Cassell tried to offer a number in the 1970s. He said 25,000, but he thought it was low. I think it was absolutely low. But whether or not we're going to get a clear answer to that question in 5 years or 10 years, I think it's still a project for our field. This is not one scholar's project. I think it's a project for many scholars over time. Thank you.
This kind of irregular warfare that you're describing is sort of bringing the violence at the large army level to the home level, and can be crossbreeding with plain out criminality or revenge seeking. You mentioned Jesse James as one guy who went on to have a pretty illustrious career as an outlaw. I mean, to what extent do you think this kind of guerrilla warfare element contributed to sort of the six-gun violence sort of the West that we sort of came to know and has become part of a legend after the war?
Yeah, the Civil War certainly provided a training ground for people like James, the Youngers, and others who go on to even more notorious career in criminality and bank robbing after the war. Essentially, the Civil War becomes kind of the whetstone to hone their skills. And they study under a real master, Bill Anderson and William Clark Quantrill, right? I mean, but ultimately, those guys flame out, not really in a blaze of glory, but in a hail of bullets.
So, in the case of John Wilkes Booth, when he assassinated Lincoln, obviously he had a number of co-conspirators. They had a lot of information about the government and government officials that average people wouldn't know. Like William Seward was directly attacked in his own home along with his family. So were any of his co-conspirators aligned with one of these guerrilla programs? And if so, or if not, were any Union government officials at any given time attacked by one of these groups?
Yeah, this is a good question about the attempted assassination. I mean, you can kind of generally apply the term irregular loosely to these guys, but I think it's much more of a self-directed sort of thing. These people were, they're assassins. I can't confirm. There is discussion that they were involved with Mosby on the evidence of this group, but no, I can't really confirm that. Thank you.
Did we have groups of these guerrillas hacking away at each other before the war?
Oh yeah. I mean, one of the reasons why Robert E. Lee and many of the West Point trained officers are so against the idea of even a controlled partisan ranger service is some of the things that they experienced during the U.S. war with Mexico. Lee's own experience seeing banditos in Mexico really shapes a lot of his ideas, I think, about what legitimate warfare is. Legitimate warfare involved large armies wearing uniforms under officers that were preferably trained at West Point or VMI. It did not involve people running around like partridges in the wilderness. I think it's the way that the discussion with D.P. Alexander goes in the morning of April 9th, 1865, when they're talking about the 1865 guerrilla option. And Lee, he rejects it. He rejects it because of the social chaos, the destruction to the social order of the White South. He was a man that was caught up in that, and he clearly understood, what this was going to bring to the South if it was let to go on and on.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about official military retaliation against communities that were supporting guerrilla activity.
Yeah, this happens in a number of places. I'll give you one example, which I think is a really poignant one. This comes out of my first book. In December of 1863, there were about 10 companies of Confederate guerrillas that were serving in northeastern North Carolina. This is the Albemarle region, it's just south of the Great Isthmus Swamp. You go out there today, there's a U.S. Coast Guard base at Elizabeth City there. They had tried to form a Partisan Ranger unit in 1862 after the government launches this policy. They never get officially authorized or recognized, but that doesn't mean these guys didn't just keep right on going with what they were doing, because nobody came down and stopped them. So they start attacking Unionists in the area, they start attacking some Confederates in the area, and Benjamin Butler happens to be up in Norfolk. He sends one of his great subordinates, a guy with a great name, Edward Augustus Wild Union general, who leads one of the first African-American combat brigades through in a counter-irregular operation in December of 1863 directly at these guys around Elizabeth City. And the beautiful thing about this is that Wild was a wonderful writer. He was Harvard educated, and many of the people that he had serving underneath him, many of the free black soldiers and some escaped slaves, had been from these communities. They know the political loyalties on the ground, they know who's a Unionist, they know which people are fence sitting, they know people who are Confederates, where they live. Wild gets a map drawn with their loyalties. He writes a more than 20-page official report of his operations. He ends up capturing local women, taking them hostage for the good behavior of the guerrillas. It becomes such an issue that the Confederate Congress sets up a special investigatory committee of what happened. They actually get some of these guerrillas to come in and testify in front of the Confederate Congress about this whole issue. What ultimately happens is that the local community is so terrified of both the guerrillas on the ground and the fact that black combat troops came through their community, that Unionists and Confederates come together at a big county meeting, send committees to Butler at Norfolk and Vance in Raleigh, the governor, the Confederate governor, Zebulon Vance, and ask that the guerrillas be removed. This is in northeastern North Carolina. Ask that the guerrillas be removed, and that please don't ever send black soldiers back through here again, and just leave us alone. They're essentially declaring a kind of neutral position and trying to opt out of the war entirely. These people were in the war very at that point. But that's one example of that. But it happens in Tennessee, it happens in Arkansas, a number of other places. Thank you.
If we should be looking at local civil wars, even though it's pre-secession, should the violence of bleeding Kansas be considered as a guerrilla start to the Civil War?
Yeah, I think that the question is about bleeding Kansas. I think that not looking at the antebellum period in Civil War books and dropping us in 1860, 1861 is a big problem with community study in general in the field. I absolutely agree. I think you have to look before the war. I don't think you can understand people's political loyalties during the war. I don't think you can understand the vendettas, the divisions within families, unless you do. But absolutely, I completely agree with that assessment. I think you need to do it. Thank you very much.